From the University of Toronto's Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy, this is the I'm Pharmacy Podcast. I'm Mina Tadros. CF is 64. He's in generally good health. Every day, he takes over 14 pills. Here's his medication list. He takes simvastatin, lisinopril, bisoprolol, Senokot, citalopram, aspirin, lansoprazole, Tylenol, calcium, and vitamin D. For those of us not in the medicine business, this feels like a lot of pills for one person to be taking in a day. But this is more common than you can imagine. Starkly, since the 1980s, the average older adult was taking around 2 pills a day. Nowadays, this is closer to 4 or 5. A clear example of too much medicine is the idea of inappropriate polypharmacy. Polypharmacy in older adults, which is usually defined as having 5 or more medications, is very common. Recent estimates suggest that close to 40% of adults over the age of 65 are prescribed at least 5 drugs. But is more better? Are all of these drugs needed? They all have evidence. They've been proven to be safe and efficacious, and there's reasons why the patients actually need to take them. And as we've learned throughout the season, the number of drug options has boomed. The Physician Desk Reference, which is a resource of all brand name drugs, was first published in 1947. At that time, it had 300 pages. The last printed version in 2017 was close to 4,000 pages, and these are only brand name drugs. There are over 14,000 drugs approved by Health Canada. With this growth in drugs has come confusion of which drugs to use when, and more importantly, making sure we don't use too many. Drugs often have interplay with each other, as we learned in the last episode when we talked a little bit about drug-drug interactions. More importantly, in the last few years, we've seen a big push in the medical community to deprescribe drugs and ensure polypharmacy is curbed. So that's what we're exploring this episode. How do these all fit together for the individual patient? Are all of these drugs studied together? How do we optimize the drugs to ensure the best for patients and their best outcomes? With so many drugs, how do we find balance? In order to better understand this problem, I spoke with Dr. Lisa McCarthy, a clinician scientist at Trillium Health Partners and associate professor at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. Dr. McCarthy's research focuses on medication management and continuity of healthcare with an aim of reducing medication-related harms and optimizing, particularly in older adults, the experiences and how medications are used.
I am somebody in my research life that gets really excited by studying the people, the processes, and the resources that we need to achieve better health for people and communities. And I get really energized by opportunities to do that by looking at how we achieve what's called evidence-based care by designing care models with the people that they're intended to serve. The research that I lead really focuses on how do we help people to get the most benefit from their medications and make sure that they're taking what they need, no less and no more.
So what would be a question or like a specific paper or project that you've worked on that sort of exemplifies that? Or maybe, I'm sure there's different components to it because it sounds like you're tackling a lot of different stuff.
I co-lead a lot of initiatives through an organization called deprescribing.org. And our mission is to help people stop taking medications that they may not need anymore. And that is done as a planned and supervised process in collaboration with health professionals and the people that are taking medication. So it's not about like, let's just stop people's medications cold turkey. It's about how do we do this in a planned way that makes sense for people.
So most of this season, we've been talking about innovation and the excitement of building a drug. Then it goes through a clinical trial. We prove that it's safe and efficacious. It gets approved to the market. Some people study the safety. We make a decision and a patient gets put on a drug. And now you're telling me we got to get them off that drug. So we did all this work to get them on it. And now we're going to take them off. Like, what's the problem that's happening here?
So using drugs, the way I think about it, like there's a continuum of prescribing. Okay. There are times when we start medication and our whole world and all of our education of our health professionals focuses on like, let's get people started. We don't do a great job about like, how do we monitor people through their journey? And we sure don't do a fantastic job about like, there are times when it makes sense to stop. So to me, a lot of what we talk about is like getting people on the right drug. but it's actually like getting people on the right drug for the right amount of time. And as you get older, or as your situation, your health changes, the risk, you've talked in other podcasts, other episodes about like risk versus benefit of medication. And to me, the nuance that hadn't come through yet is that risk benefit ratio changes for people over time.
Yes.
And so that's a key point to me about why we need to think about deprescribing as part of a prescribing continuum. It's backing off at a certain point when it makes sense to do so.
So is it as easy as just stopping a medication?
If only, friend, right?
Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about like risk versus benefit of starting a medication. When we start actually thinking about like risk versus benefit across this whole, like if we think about like this whole continuum or whatever we're going to call it, where we start, we monitor in the middle, and we stop. You've got to think on both ends of those poles about risk versus benefit. So for stopping or for starting a medication, that makes sense, right? The risks are the side effects, potential adverse effects. Benefits are like, what's my gain? On the stopping side, you've also got to think about what's the benefit of stopping medications. And for like a lot of older adults, they're experiencing effects from medications that are not great for them. Over time, your risk-benefit ratio changes, and the benefit you once had maybe is diminishing, or your circumstances have changed, right? And so you're not going to get the same benefit anymore. But also, there's the risk of stopping the medication. So we talk about something called, it's a technical term, but adverse drug withdrawal events. And so sometimes when we're stopping a medication, we have to taper, or we have to watch for different effects that we have coming off. And so it's actually like a 4-quadrant kind of decision that you have to make, right? When you're thinking about risk versus benefit, there's the risk benefit of continuing and the risk benefit of stopping.
Like one thing that's sort of been running around in my head as I prepared for this episode was, for a long time, when I remember in pharmacy school, we were talking about like suboptimal care. Someone has an MI or a heart attack, they have to be on a certain list of drugs, and we'd be like, oh, only 60% of patients meet evidence-based guidelines. So we were all about like getting patients started. And then a few years ago, it was like, how do we stop them? And is it easier to work on not getting them started on those drugs to begin with? Or is that not even a question? Like what's easier? Should we just get people not started on inappropriate medications to begin with? Or is it getting them off them? Like if you had to develop interventions and invest, where would you pick? The start or the chicken or the egg here? Like where do you start?
To me, this whole like, I often talk about this kind of topic as like optimal medication use is this like tangled ball of yarn. Okay. And we've got like all these different aspects of this. And so I'm not sure actually like that there's one thread that you pull that's going to be the magic one that untangles the whole ball of yarn, right? Like it's like this wicked problem, right? And so maybe what we all have to do is pull at our little pieces and hope that like over time we're going to make some progress. We might end up with a big tangled knot and we'll have to deal with that. But I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I've worked on both sides of that. And I think there's been more momentum lately about stopping medications because I think people are starting to recognize that like this problem of like, they're not being well served by the medications they're taking. They're taking so many, it's hard to manage. It's costing us a ton of money. So we've already got people in the situations, we have to undo them. Certainly, I'm all as a pharmacist about preventing. And I think if we could get people like as clinicians to think about, is this the right medication for this person right now? And how long should they take this medication? We don't think about that. We get them to start, but we don't necessarily think about how long. There's a couple of things we could really do at the beginning of like starting a medication process that would really serve the system all the way through, right? So if people would say why they prescribe something, like they document the reason that they use it or the indication, like there would be so many problems solved down the care pathway if we knew why they started in the first place and we knew how long it was intended to be.
Like I recently emailed one of my colleagues and I said, oh, we should get family doctors to improve, pick whatever projects on the top of my head. And he said, do you know how many things we keep getting emails about to try to improve? Like it's like we've got, someone's telling me to improve my benzo prescribing, my opioid prescribing, my screenings, my this, my that. And so how do we, there's a fatigue of interventions, 100%. Right? Like, and I think like we have to think through how to optimize that for sure. Yeah. And it's probably more of a system issue than a drug issue, right? Like this is just a byproduct.
Yeah. And it's funny because what will like resonate or work for one clinician and where it starts is different, right? For each clinician. So when I talk about people, it's funny when I talk to pharmacists about like deprescribing or optimizing therapy, I'm not convinced that it matters so much where you start at this point is that you do start something. So like I kind of talk to them about like pick what's in your sphere of influence. And if it's low hanging fruit, that's okay. You're still like contributing to like untangling the crazy ball of yarn, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my bent on it. So I wish I had a chicken or egg answer. I don't know.
So are pharmacists the silver bullet to this, or is it just, because sometimes we hear, well, maybe if you just empowered pharmacists to help with some of this, like case management or whatever it may be, then we could solve this. Is that the case?
So it's never as simple, right, as just that idea, right? So we've done studies with like community pharmacists looking at, so I had a graduate student like looking at their appetite for being involved in deprescribing. And what they told us, based on the system that they were in, was that they were great at so pharmacists were awesome at identifying problems, eh? We can identify it when it comes down to taking a recommendation, like making one recommendation, not giving somebody a whole list of problems, but making one recommendation and then following it through over time. It's harder. Now, the system is set up so that it's harder for us to do that. And oftentimes community pharmacists would say, hey, I can identify this problem, but I don't have enough information to confirm this is the actual situation or to make the judgment about the risk-benefit scenario for that particular patient. So I think it partly depends on care setting and what you're empowered to do in your individual practice. But I think it's hard to say, hey, that role. Also, I talk to community pharmacists now. We're trying to design an intervention for something we can talk about later called prescribing cascades. And like they're pretty burnt. We are setting community pharmacies up as like public health hubs, which we've talked about for years. And COVID has really seen that like realized in ways. But now we're asking pharmacists to do so many things. And so
and
this
we're
is
not
one
paying
more.
For it.
And we don't pay for it. Yeah, that's another one.
One of your areas of work that I'm intrigued by is this idea of prescribing cascades. So maybe you could walk us through like, what is a prescribing cascade? Where'd you get this idea from? And what can be done about it?
So all of this field is plagued by this terminology problem. I think I probably confided to you like offline that like even the term deprescribing is not one that I love, right? People associate it with taking away and not necessarily in the best way in terms of the public. And yet it's a term that's caught on. And so now I find myself using it. But anyway, prescribing cascades are another one of these things that suffer a little bit from like, we're trying to work out the concept. The original idea of prescribing cascade came from like a clinical observation that people get a medication prescribed, they experience an adverse event or a side effect. Usually it's like longer out. So it's not like somebody takes an antibiotic and gets a rash within a few days and somebody can connect the dots that, hey, that might be the medication. Usually they're longer, more insidious kind of things that take time to develop. And so they often get mistaken for a new medical condition, and then someone uses a medication to treat it. So that was the original clinical observation that led to this phenomenon or this term prescribing cascades, right? And it makes sense. Drug, side effect that gets interpreted as something else, and a new medication. When we started to try and do more studies back, how long have I been doing this? 7 or 8 years ago now, we found that it was really hard to actually operationalize that clinical concept in terms of doing studies, particularly with like healthcare administrative data, because you don't actually know when a clinician kind of misinterpreted a side effect as a new medical condition. So we wrote this paper where we're like, hey, maybe the problem is actually like medication side effect leading to a new medication like that, or maybe the phenomenon, a cascade, is medication side effect leading to a new medication. And a big subset of that is when somebody misses it or misinterprets and does it unintentionally, prescribes that new one. But it can also be a problem sometimes when somebody does it on purpose. So, a classic example of that is like people take calcium channel blockers for hypertension, really commonly used. A side effect that they often experience is like swelling in their ankles or pedal edema is what it's called. And clinicians use diuretics to treat that. Sometimes they are doing it because even when they recognize that the calcium channel blocker is causing it, because they're like, hey, I don't have any other options. The problem is there's on that one a mismatch. calcium channel blocker edema is caused by like fluid shifts in the body, and diuretics treat fluid overload. So what you actually end up doing is you have this mismatch in mechanisms where you think you're solving the problem and you're not. So that one, regardless of like whether somebody did it on purpose or not, is always a problem.
It's kind of intriguing because, it's not like the side effects we think about in the sense of like something to stop a drug, or it's like a very serious adverse event, in the sense that like it's under the radar, but it also leads to this other problem that you were talking about, which is polypharmacy, right? That you just end up adding more and more drugs. And I think after reading your work, I started to look more closely at the patients I saw and think about how do they get to where they are. And I think it's like way more common than we realize. And so I thought it was super interesting, and maybe another driving force. I think I was trying to tackle the phenomenon of like, why are people on so many medications? And I think the biggest thing is we just have more options.
A lot of options.
But then also like, we're trying to offer these options to everything. And where does that everything come from? It could come from side effects. It could come from aging. It could come from us better diagnosing things. So there's a whole multitude of things, both good and bad, that's leading to this rise. Like, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
And it gets a little bit like, wow, okay, where do I start today? if you really start going down the why. I mean, we have a culture of prescribing. Right? We have a culture of medication use. And what does it come from? It comes from, we have powerful medications. We have lots of options. In some parts of the world, you have maybe better access to those medication therapies than you do to other things like non-pharmacological like options that would also address the ailment. And so there's a whole host of reasons why is it a medication. But in a lot of places, a lot of interactions, that's what people are looking for.
So if you could take out your crystal ball, where do you think your field is going over the next 10, 20 years? Like, are there going to be massive innovations that are coming? Like, are there things that are going to shape or solve this problem? Or is the problem just going to get worse? Like, where do you think things are going?
There is a momentum now that I've seen in the last 10, maybe not quite 10 years, in terms of awareness of this problem. So I think as pharmacists, we've been aware of this for years. And it's funny, when I first started my research career, people are like, hey, yeah, this is a big problem, but like, there's no interest in really dealing with this. You're dealing against like pharmaceutical companies and innovation, and you're going to be fighting a losing battle if you start trying to do a career in like getting people to stop medications they don't need anymore. And I think there's been a real shift in that. We've seen like almost every like jurisdiction has like a deprescribing network that's formed now. And there's a real momentum. I was just actually at a meeting last week where like the Americans brought together people from across the world to talk about deprescribing and what do we still need to know. There's a ton of work still to do in addressing this problem. But I do receive what you say about like, is it an upstream intervention to try and optimize therapy and get the things in place? Or is it about stopping medications people no longer need? I think it's both right now.
Right.
My blue sky would be like, ideally, hey, let's get it right. And let's put systems in place to support people through, knowing that medication needs change over time. But I'm not sure that we're ready to not do the other pole yet, which is get people off stuff they don't need anymore.
After speaking with Dr. McCarthy, it became very obvious that it wasn't just about the right drug. It was more about the right drug, right time, right person, and really trying to find that optimal use. There are a variety of problems that might lead to this. Different patients that weren't studied, combinations of drugs. There was also this question of these cascades of drugs causing side effects we don't understand and may not be looking for. But what could be done about it? To better learn about interventions that can improve and optimize use of medications, I spoke with Dean Lisa Dolovich. Dean Dolovich's research concentrates on how to improve and evaluate interventions and different practice models that try to tackle healthcare delivery, medication management, and pharmacy practice.
The research I do focuses on really at the heart, making sure or doing things that can help us understand how people are getting the best from their medications and how the whole healthcare system, including all the people that are helping individuals in their home, can also help people get the most from their medication and be the most healthy.
In the media, there's a narrative about too many drugs. And I have patients come into the pharmacy, I'm on 13 drugs. Like, I'm on too many. And then when I talk to researchers, a lot of interventions that we're having are either, depending on the drug class, but sometimes they're like, how do we ensure that you're getting the right drugs that meet the guidelines? If someone had, they're not on their ACE or their ARB, which are blood pressure medications, and they've had a heart, and that's how we measure metrics on like Medicaid. So it feels like we're kind of tackling the problem in two different ways. Or is it the same problem? We're just not seeing it the right way.
It's so interesting that you say that, because in the early days of my research with others, we did a study called the SMART study. And we initially thought that our main outcome was going to be the reduction in the numbers of medications people took. And our study was done in the late 90s. And it was actually just when we were starting to learn about a number of new medications that were coming on that were helping people, especially cardiovascular heart medications. And what we found after the few years of that study was that instead of medications going down, there were certainly medications that were removed or taken away or discontinued from people where they might not have had benefit. But we added just as many or more medications that would be thought to benefit the individual. So our whole paradigm at that time switched to, okay, wait a minute, it's not just about taking away medications. Like, in other words, people are not just on too many, like you said, but it is about making sure people are also getting medications. But sometimes you might end up on more medications than you started with after a review, because there are more and more new medications coming out that are specialized, and sometimes better combinations of medications now are being taken that have a better effect than just one on their own. And so I think you don't know where you're going to end up with when you sort of start down a road with an individual. It may be that they end up on more medications than they start with after a review.
So medication management has been an important topic for the last long time. Has it gotten better? Are we doing a better job? Or is it just there's too many drugs and it's just getting more complicated?
I think it's all those things.
Yeah.
I think we are doing a better job. I feel like we are seeing more communication amongst healthcare providers from different sectors and organizations. I think we're seeing patients and their families more engaged because of either their interests, or it's becoming easier, or the tools that we have are making it easier for them to do that. But I also think it's getting even more complicated. We're seeing more specialty medications, more niche medications, more new technologies coming. So it's the scenario is becoming complicated, and that means that actually more people probably have to be at the table to figure out how to make the best decisions for an individual.
So where do you see that space going with medication management? Like, what, you've pointed out some problems. Like, where do you think it's going to go in the next little while?
I think it's going to be critical that there's a mechanism for the right teams of people to come around to help make those decisions with that individual. And so it's going to be integrated systems, better communication, probably virtual or electronic tools.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is, not always the same team for every situation. So a patient's going to need certain people at the table for certain decisions, and then other people at the table for other decisions. And our system's not at all set up for that yet, but it probably needs to be. And I also think it's going to be even more important for the patient and their family's wishes and needs to be more explicit. What are the person's goals for their life and their health? What matters to them? Having that be more visible so that everybody on that health person's team healthcare team can actually answer or meet that need for that individual. So you asked me what's needed. I think sort of an integrated system around that concept is going to be really important.
It almost feels like an exercise in optimization rather than, pulling people like as a drug. That's, I guess, what it felt like too singular to be like, we're going to remove medications or add medications versus just optimizing your care, that whatever you need, which I think is what you're trying to get at with the wording that you're using.
Yeah. Yeah. Optimize is a great word.
So you mentioned the SMART study, and how do you ask your questions?
I start with not asking the question by myself. I work in teams, and those teams are from people from different disciplines. In my case, it'd be people with pharmacy backgrounds, people with primary care backgrounds, so different health disciplines, different types of methodologists. Certainly the people who are working in the environment are really important. Mm-hmm. So if it's clinicians, whichever clinicians, and then the patient, what's been the patient experience with the situation. So trying to just have discussions and say, well, what's really the issue here? Like, what is it that we're really trying to address? What's the problem we're trying to solve? And what's the kind of outcome that we want to look for that would be important to a patient, that would be important to their family, that would be important to the healthcare team, and that we can actually measure. So lots of times you come up with questions that you discard because you just can't really measure that really easily. But we'll sit around and we'll talk about the situation and then try to come up with a number of questions, usually more than one, like a primary question that we think we can ask and answer in a sort of a realistic fashion with a great metric that we think is important, but then lots of secondary questions because we often want to understand the context or the story. Mm-hmm. So usually you can't find, usually one answer to a research question isn't going to tell you the story when you're looking at optimizing medications. So a good example could be in our primary care studies, when we looked at pharmacists being embedded in primary care teams, we knew that pharmacists were going to do new things, like have new roles within their teams. And we talked a lot about, well, what could those roles be? How would they actually get to know their new environment? And what was going to be important for everybody to say, is this even a useful or effective place for pharmacists to practice? So we thought first we have to, we had a number of questions, and they're related to how would we train pharmacists? How would they feel about the experience being even in a team? How would the clinicians feel about them being there? But then what could they do? What were the activities that they were going to do when they were in the team? How could we study the journey that they were on while they were in this really new practice setting and no one was used to them? And then what was going to be important was the effect that they were going to have. So would they actually change the clinical, overall, the clinical situation of the patients that they were taking care of? So could we see that particular medication use changed? Were they going to be on certain medications that were going to be more beneficial, like heart medications or diabetes medications or those types of things? And then were things like their blood pressure, was that going to change? Were overall, of all the patients they took care of, was their blood pressure going to improve, as an example? Was their cholesterol going to improve? Was their diabetes metrics going to improve? And so we looked at all of those in the course of our study, and we found when we looked at all of that we did show improvements. But we also looked at all those other questions I was talking about because we wanted to know the story behind how they became integrated into the primary care environment.
Like, how do you find out how somebody works? Like, I'd hate for somebody to know how I work, right? It'd be a disaster. So how do you better understand that?
Good. Yeah. So there's so many different kinds of methodologies. And of course, the research question will derive the methods that one uses. So for those questions, looking at the journey, we actually had pharmacists, as an example, write narrative reports. So we had lots of discussions about that because pharmacists, and almost not very many actually, people usually like to write a diary.
I was going to say, is this like journaling?
It's a diary. We had them journal. So we had the pharmacists journal their experience. And so every month or whatever, they had to write a journal log about what their experience was like and send it in so that we could read it and analyze across all the pharmacists and all the journal notes just what was happening.
And was it tough getting people to journal a lot? Like, I find if someone asked me that, I'd probably not submit a lot.
That was not the most favorite thing that we asked them to do. I was going to say, that's not really. No, I think we're all much more used to sort of quantitative or surveys where we check boxes. And so those things, we did those too, because some of the questions I was talking about also mean that you need to use surveys. But certainly when we asked pharmacists to journal, that was met with mostly, people were very positive about trying it, but it was hard. And the hardest thing was getting into the rhythm of it. So it wasn't an easy ask at the beginning, but then everyone actually liked the reflection part of it once they got into it. And we found that the notes were getting longer and longer, and they went from maybe bullet points at the beginning to a bit more narrative and journal-like towards the end. Overall, some people, everybody has different experience, but it was kind of interesting to be able to do it that way. And then they were so rich, the information that were coming from the journals, the journal sort of pieces were really rich, and we could really understand how people felt and what they were experiencing. So we got a really good understanding that people were going through an emotional roller coaster. That was one of the themes that really came forward when we looked at the journals, how isolating it was to be by yourself, starting in a new practice, not having another pharmacist around who's paved the way before you. And people could really share just what it was like to try new things, to meet new people, in some cases to not have people know, who you were, what they were, how they were supposed to interact with you in the healthcare team. And it was very emotional. We also found by month 4, that was really the worst month. I would say that if we had asked everybody if they wanted to continue in their role at month 4, we might have had people say, I'm not sure I want to continue, but everyone was so amazing. They persevered. And by month 6, things really started to turn around. And by month 9, everyone was, really feeling like they had finally cracked the code of what it was like to be embedded. Yeah. And we wouldn't have got that information from surveys. We would have got overall, things are going okay. And then things were maybe going well. And then things were going very well. But we would never have understood the richness, the depth there.
Yeah. So I from that, I have 2 questions, which I obviously, full confession here, I'm obviously a quantitative person. So I work with qualitative researchers, and I'm learning quite a bit. But, one thing that has been a steep learning curve for me is one, you're asking them about their experience, but then you're also measuring, and their experiences from their lens, right? It's, their opinions in a way of what they're going through, but yet you're going to quantify something and measure it. And how do you juxtaposition the 2 results to each other? Like, is that always a challenge, or do you find that they've always kind of helped you understand one versus the other?
I think it's great to have those different sources of data.
Yeah.
I think in mixed methods work, where we use some qualitative and some quantitative and put them together, we can see, do the results triangulate? Like, do they actually show similar things, similar trends, similar experiences? If the pharmacists are sharing that they think that they're having an impact, and then we see an impact on a quantitative measure, that's actually great. Or if we don't, then we delve into that. Like, why is it that we're seeing one thing with one set of data and not with another? So that can often be way richer than understanding, than having 2 sets of, or just one set of data alone.
And then translating that information to the public or to stakeholders. Do you think that they quite understand what the nuanced difference between a quantitative and a qualitative study are? Like, when you go and say, like, some pharmacists experience this, is it just me, or do you find the public say, well, how many of them, right? Is this a big problem, or is this one person? I don't think
it's a problem, because we all respond, I think, to stories.
Yeah.
So when we read the news or see the news, however we see the news these days, we are actually hearing about stories of whatever it is that we're interested in. And these are also stories. So the qualitative research provides us with stories, and the quantitative research also can be translated into a story of how an intervention or how an effect has happened. And I think they both add a lot of richness to the situation.
So one soapbox that I've kind of stood on, and I'll admit, because maybe I don't do a lot of pharmacy practice research that I may miss the mark on, is it felt for a long time, a lot of papers I would read, not all, were trying to prove that pharmacists can do good. Like, they were just trying to prove pharmacy, like, that we can actually help patient care. And a criticism that I've had is that, not a lot of professions have to go through that. Like, I don't see physicians having to prove that they have value to the healthcare system. Nurses don't do that. A lot of other, everyone knows their value. It's about optimizing, not to use that word again, but, it's like figuring out how best to use them. And yet pharmacy continually has to prove that it has value. And yet I think, I tell people, like, maybe we should just have a little bit of a chip or a little swagger to say, like, no, we have values. Let's just figure out how to use us best. But maybe I'm just pessimistic and I'm looking at the literature wrong. But is that really how the questions were answered? We are an extremely well-studied profession.
So I agree with you. We study ourselves, and we have there's a lot of effort put into that. So I agree there. I think it's the nature of how pharmacy is set up right now. Yeah. So I think it could be fair to say that when there's pharmacy has a commercial element, which, by the way, all healthcare providers have a commercial element too, but it's just not as visible. I think there's maybe a larger onus on pharmacy to highlight the professional value and to figure out the model of how that can work in the system.
Yeah, so this is a perfect segue to the last question I have for you. How does the discovery pharmacy fit into all of this? Like, we've talked about optimizing medication use, pharmacy practice moving forward. Is the work that you're doing on building the discovery pharmacy, is there, I'm guessing there's a parallel here. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the discovery pharmacy and what you envision, how it addresses some of these issues that we've been talking about today.
Yeah. So the discovery pharmacy is an academic pharmacy with two main goals. One is to do research, testing innovations and new ways of doing things. And the other is to be a place for experiential education for all types of students, healthcare professional, otherwise. But I think the reason why I think discovery pharmacy is important or could be helpful is it's a place where we can study how to do things within an interprofessional pharmacy-led environment, and then also whether that's effective. So, and you'll notice I said interprofessional because the discovery pharmacy is not only about pharmacists or the pharmacy team sort of doing things in healthcare. Yeah. It's about how the pharmacy professionals work with the other members of the healthcare team. So anything that we do is interdisciplinary. That's our hope, our plan. And we want to set the pharmacy up for having information available in an everyday way from people who are receiving care at the discovery pharmacy so that we can measure how well we're doing.
We learned this episode about the growing problem of polypharmacy. More importantly, I learned to see this not just as a push or a pull, but rather a question of optimization. A really tricky problem plagued by a chicken or an egg. Do you start or do you stop? But rather, it's probably both. A nuance of shifting risk-benefit that changes over time for patients. And because of that, we learned about the importance of patient autonomy and leveraging shared decision-making. With more drugs entering the market, optimization will become critical to ensuring proper patient outcomes and finding that balance of risk and benefit. And lastly, and probably very exciting for me for a very biased reason, the opportunity for pharmacy to play a critical role in helping find optimal use. This episode of the I'm Pharmacy podcast was produced by Steve Southon, Kate Richards, and me, Mina Tadros. It was edited by Steve Southon with musical support from Steve Southon and Diego Martinez. Special thanks to Dean Lisa Dolovich and Dr. Lisa McCarthy. We'll be dropping new episodes every month, so be sure to subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. Keep asking questions, stay safe, and catch you next episode.